But Christians are people who remember the past, and today and always we remember you, and we say thank you for all that you did and all that you continue to do for us and the world. We say thank you for the wars that you fought, for raising our parents, for the sacrifices you made, big and small. In all this, we want to take this opportunity to honor you and to say thank you. In today's gospel, Jesus said that this is an evil generation. And certainly our generation has its evils, and we've noted them here at Ritter throughout the year. In the first Mass of the school year, we looked at all the ways in which the dignity of the human person is violated by our generation. The dignity of the person has been our theme for this entire school year. And you, our grandparents, provide another opportunity for us to look at the issue of human dignity. Our generation has largely looked on aging as a curse and has told you grandparents many false things. It has told you that any suffering you endure as you age is meaningless. With regards to aging today, you often hear one of the most subtly arrogant phrases, and that is quality of life. We use the phrase quality of life to rationalize speeding along the termination of life for our elderly and aging. One summer as a seminarian, I worked as a chaplain at a hospital. A volunteer called me to come up and pray with her one afternoon by the bed of a man who was dying. The man had been in a coma for a while, and his family, 53 days earlier, had made the decision to stop feeding him because his quality of life was bad. Not surprisingly, the family had not been back to visit since then, and myself and the angelic volunteer were left to keep vigil at his bedside as he starved to death. Quality of life is a gross phrase because it presumes that we can judge the value of a person's life from outside. Is there anything worse to say or do than judge a person's quality of life from afar? And yet we do that. People who don't have the first bit of first-hand experience with physical suffering write op-ed pieces and give political speeches using the phrase quality of life and suggests that suffering has no meaning. When we use the phrase quality of life, it also presumes that suffering is meaningless. The good news that we are supposed to proclaim to the world as Christians is that because of the cross, suffering is not meaningless, but that it is now holy. I ask grandparents and students alike, do you think of suffering as holy? My grandfather passed away 2 years ago from Alzheimer's, and my grandmother cared for him night and day over the 10 years where his body slowly deteriorated. The last few years, my grandfather was, from all outward appearances, as the very coarse phrase likes to say it, a vegetable. But who am I to judge what his experience was because he couldn't stand up and turn a cartwheel or carry on a conversation? There may come a day when I meet my grandfather again after this life, and he may very well tell me that those days as a vegetable were his best days. Perhaps during that time he was in conversation with God the entire 2 years. How do I know? The point is, it is awfully arrogant of me to judge my grandfather's experience from afar and to say that his quality of life was poor. Counseling 101 says that if someone is uneasy in a situation, that's that person's problem. And I think the same goes for us watching people suffer. If we can't stand to be with someone whose body is rebelling against them because of age, that's our issue, not the person aging or the sick person. I think that's usually the case, that most people who are uneasy are afraid of our own death or of our own suffering, so we ignore others or we pull the plug because we say their quality of life was poor. Jesus chose the cross. He chose suffering. And then he said, "Do this in memory of me." Do what I did. Endure the suffering that is put in your way because it is holy. I can't help but mention the witness of our late Holy Father, Pope John Paul II. He wrote much about suffering and the dignity of the human person and of the elderly. And God gave him a chance to live out his teaching at the end of his life. John Paul II's body deteriorated over time. The effects of his Parkinson's began to show 5 to 10 years before his death. His speech slowly faltered over time. He began walking with a hunch in his back and was eventually forced to use a wheelchair. A few days before his death, he was wheeled to his papal window to address throngs of young people who had come to cheer him on. And if you've seen the video, you could tell he was straining to speak. But his body would no longer cooperate with his spirit, and he was finally wheeled back into his room. The Holy Father never spoke publicly again. Given all that he endured in those final days until he finally lost his life 6 years ago, would we really pity him? Would we really judge his quality of life? Would we say he would have been better off if he had died 5 years earlier? Would we say his final years were meaningless? In the movie Apollo 13, there is a great line. If you've never seen the movie, it's the story of the true story of a faulty mission to the moon. And the astronauts had to eventually return back home without reaching the moon. And most of the time, it looked like the astronauts were going to die in space. And as things start to look grim around the NASA headquarters, and it looks as if the astronauts might die in space, one NASA employee says, "This could be the worst disaster in NASA's history." The guy in charge barks back, "With all due respect, sir, I believe this may be our finest hour." I think the same thing applies to us in our lives, especially as we begin to age. As we age, our body will slowly rebel against us. The question is, how do we view that process? Do we, out of our own fears, search for anti-aging face creams, shampoos, lotions, surgeries, etc.? Do we fear it and think it meaningless and to be gotten over as quickly as possible? Or do we believe that our final years may be our finest hour? Concerning the elderly, John Paul II said to young people, and I think his words apply to us today as well. He said, quote, "I would also like to say a word to the young, to invite them to remain close to the elderly. Dear young people, I urge you to do this with great love and generosity. Older people can give you much more than you can imagine." Is there a better quote that would sum up our experience today on Grandparents' Day? Grandparents and students, don't listen to people who judge quality of life from a distance. At Ritter, our motto is that we dare to be different. We live in the midst of an evil generation, but we dare to be different. If you, as students, want to affirm the dignity of the human person, look no further than grandparents and these wonderful people who are sitting right in front of you. And grandparents, we turn to you and say once again, thank you for your witness.